Hi, everyone. Welcome to Dive in the Podcast, your favorite podcast about all types of diving, scuba, free diving, tech diving, and more. We cover it all. Every week on Monday, we post new episodes filled with diving news, interesting dive topics, environmentalism, and much more. This week, we're talking to Jason Weichert, owner of Torpedo Rays Scuba. We spoke with him on what it's like to run a dive shop for nearly a quarter century, his diving experience, and the divers that came before him. But before that, we have some diving news about commercial divers and how they could help the battle against coronavirus. We'll chat buoyancy control and how it protects our ecosystems, and coming up later in the show, we'll do our first dive site review at everyone's favorite site. I think you might be able to guess which one it is. We'll get a reading recommendation with a challenge and a word on safety. We'll also learn who we should follow next on social media. Before we get started, though, let me introduce our hosts. First up, Nick Fisher. How's it going tonight?
Going great. Thanks for having me back, Justin.
Absolutely. You're welcome. Jesus. Nicholas Winkler, how are you doing today?
Pretty good. Glad to be back on the show.
Thanks for being here. April Weichert, happy birthday. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. There's no other way I'd like to spend my birthday than talking to you lovely people on this lovely podcast.
Somehow I doubt that.
You shouldn't. You're my favorite people in the world.
Oh, that's nice. Speaking of favorite people in the world, no, that's not really the toss I was looking for. The Times, a British newspaper, reported...
Yeah, they are my favorite people in the world. I love the British Times.
Oh, God.
I thought you were going to say my dad.
What a great toss.
No, not at all. The tosses, I do them well. They reported on April 12th that the British National Health System was recruiting commercial divers to help with oxygen administration and management. Quote, more than 500 deep-sea divers who have experience of coping with breathing difficulties have been drafted in to help the NHS treat chronically ill coronavirus patients. These divers are all medical technicians who are experts in managing oxygen flow. They have volunteered to help the NHS staff overloaded with patients requiring enhanced oxygen supply through masks or ventilators, end quote. These are divers who normally work in crazy environments like oil rigs, and they're multitaskers. They work in high stress, high risk environments. They're comfortable in PPE. They can problem solve. There's currently 10 of these divers who volunteered, of the 500 volunteers working at the ICU in the Royal Free Hospital in London. So if things go well, they'll expand that to hospitals all over England in the coming weeks. Earlier in the week, we spoke with Jason Weichert. He's the owner of Torpedo Rays Scuba, and we chatted with him a bit about his history in diving and his history in owning a dive shop.
Today we are interviewing a very special guest. This guy owns and operates your favorite local dive shop, Torpedo Rays Scuba. He keeps us all employed, he paid for all this equipment, and he happens to be my father. We're really excited to have Jason Weichert on the podcast today. We're going to dive in and ask him some questions about his career, diving history, and favorite things. So, to start off, why did you want to open a dive shop?
Well, it's one of those things where they say if you do something you love, then you never work a day in your life. And I really love scuba diving, and it was a lot more fun than Canadian Tire, where I was working at the current time. So it seemed like a natural move for me.
The name Torpedo Rays Scuba is pretty distinct, but what the listeners really want to know is what were the names that didn't make the cut?
That's a good question. We tossed around a whole bunch of different names. We were trying to stay away from something that was really run-of-the-mill, dive center or scuba world or anything like that. There's a million dive shops in the world with those names, and we wanted something really super unique. We wanted something kind of with a Nova Scotia flair. We were trying to tie in something with lobster. Lobster divers didn't really seem to have the right ring to it.
Right.
So at the end of the day, we kind of flipped through a book of Nova Scotia marine life and noticed the Torpedo Ray, common to Nova Scotia waters, and thought, it's an interesting play on words, Torpedo Ray, Torpedo Rays, and came up with Torpedo Ray Scuba. Turned out the joke was kind of on us because it seems like 90% of people have never heard of a Torpedo Ray and just assume my name is Ray.
Right. Anyone that's worked there has got a call asking for Ray.
Or
many
saying,
times.
I know Ray.
I know Ray. Can I have a discount, please?
Yeah.
Wait, what? Your name is not Ray?
Yeah, the Torpedo Rays used to be a lot more prevalent in Nova Scotia, too, than they are these days, though, right?
Yeah, I mean, 20 years ago, you saw a few more of them around. I mean, they've never been super common sightings. I think in all of my dives in Nova Scotia, I've seen maybe a half a dozen. But they're certainly a very interesting creature if you do see one underwater.
Just don't try to ride it. I guess that's the number one rule.
Definitely being electric, you do not want to attempt to ride one. It would be a shocking experience.
Seeing how the shop's been around longer than most people around here have been diving, is there anything from early in your scuba days that might surprise divers that are learning to dive these days?
I don't know if there's anything that would surprise them. People might be surprised really how popular diving was 25 years ago in Nova Scotia. That was sort of the peak time for diving here. Some weekends there'd be 4 or 5 charter boats full of divers on the water. There was 7 dive shops in Nova Scotia. It just seemed like everyone you talked to was into scuba diving back then. And not that we don't have a strong dive community now, but it's not, say, at the peak like it was 25 years ago.
Yeah, I wonder what's changed between now and then that has led to maybe a general decline in the overall number of divers in the Nova Scotia area.
Yeah, I think some of it has to do with popular media. There was a lot more water-related shows, scuba-related shows on TV, and that always piques people's interest in learning a particular sport or hobby. As horrible as it is to say, Baywatch was really important. Baywatch had a lot of water scenes and a lot of scuba diving, and everybody watched Baywatch, and we'd get people in all the time. Man, I want to learn to scuba dive because I was watching Baywatch, and David Hasselhoff's awesome.
That is both amazing and truly terrifying.
It is.
So we should start a TV show instead of a podcast? Is that what you're saying?
Well, or we should hire David Hasselhoff, one or the other. I don't think he's doing much these days, so...
And he's probably in Germany making millions of dollars doing ads.
He's a rock star over there.
Yeah. So I guess was going to ask some of the changes you've seen in the industry over the years. It sounds like there's been a little bit of decline. Anything else you've noticed?
Well, certainly the gear has gotten a lot better, a lot more comfortable, obviously a lot more technologically advanced. I mean, the dive computers we have today, it's like comparing a Commodore VIC-20 as a home computer to today's, iMac. And a lot more safer as well. So that's a key thing in scuba diving is always make things both easy and safe. And I definitely think both of those things have happened in spades. Yeah,
it's true. I've noticed that dive computers, I always make the joke that dive computers are probably safer than the divers that are using them these days, which is a big change.
Probably true, yeah.
So is there, looking back on the career, is there anything you would have changed or done differently as a dive shop owner? Oh,
that's a good question. Hindsight's always 20/20. I wouldn't say there's anything radically different we would have done. You'd always like to get more dives in and see more parts of the world, but I think overall we've stayed the course pretty well. Also, I guess looking back again, is there any piece of equipment that is out today that you would have never imagined seeing in year one of Torpedo Rays? Again, the advancement in dive computers, I couldn't imagine how amazing they are now with full color screens and being upgradable, being able to do trimix, and being able to have multiple transmitters all linked to the same computer. It's pretty astonishing compared to the first computers, which were obviously very large and very basic. Right. I remember that old flat screen monitor we had in the shop, just the computer monitor. I think you told me you got that for some obscene amount of money way back in the day. One of the earliest LCD screens for a PC, let alone like a high definition screen on your wrist. Yeah, I mean, some of the early computers, like the old Daycore micro brains, again, extremely large, basic algorithms in them weren't particularly safe. I'm not sure that they were even safe to use. If anyone has one today, please, for God's sakes, nail it to your rec room wall. Don't try to dive with it. This computer is much, much safer, much, much more reliable. I guess that's another change really seen in a lot of dive gear is reliability. 25 years ago when you were diving, not at all unusual to see gear issues, whereas now it's somewhat of an anomaly to have an issue with a piece of gear unless you're not maintaining it properly. That's a good point. And so things have kind of evened out a bit. And that means you can pick and choose your equipment based on the finer points or the little details and not the broader, like, oh, I can't buy X brand because it's no good. I was going to say, I think as long as you stay to the major equipment manufacturers, there's really nobody making bad equipment anymore. I mean, again, years ago, there were brands, I won't name any names, but there were some you definitely wanted to stay away from because they weren't known for making great quality gear. But now with everyone's focus on safety, like I say, as long as you stick to a major, well-known brand name, not something that only exists on the internet, you're probably pretty safe.
Looking back over as towards the shop owner side of things, the entrepreneur side of things, is there any advice you'd give somebody wanting to open a business based on a passion, not necessarily a scuba shop, but something they really like to do?
Well, I'd say make sure, first of all, that you actually enjoy business, not just what you want to get into, because you're going to spend 80% of your time running the business and maybe 10 or 20% of your time doing the thing you love. So, if you love horseback riding, make sure you love the business of horseback riding, not just riding horses. Because if you don't like the business, then you should just stay riding horses. Don't try to get into the business, because then you'll spend 80% of your time hating what you do.
Man, that's excellent advice there.
That's good advice.
So change gears a little bit here and actually talk about some scuba diving. What was one of your best dives in the Maritimes?
Oh, best dives in the Maritimes. There have definitely been many. I would have to say diving the wreck of the Kokosnik, also known as the Russian, just off Sambro Island. We've done many, many times. It's a bit of a technical wreck, sort of starts about 110, 115 feet, runs down about 150. It was a Russian freighter sunk in World War II under somewhat nefarious circumstances. But probably the most interesting part of it is there's actual tanks on the bottom. You can go down and see intact tanks just sitting on the bottom. Get a picture of yourself sitting on top of one of the tanks. There's also a large stern gun and a lot of supplies, because it was carrying supplies for the war. So it's a pretty spectacular dive.
That is, it really does. I mean, I can't believe I've been here almost a decade and I still have never dove that wreck, unfortunately. But yeah, it's kind of crazy. People travel literally halfway around the world to like dive on some intact ships with tanks or jeeps or something on it. And we literally have that sitting a swimming distance away from shore outside of Halifax Harbor.
That's very true. I think a lot of local divers that mainly do travel diving don't actually understand how good the diving is in Nova Scotia and what Nova Scotia has to offer, as you say, just in terms of shipwrecks alone. It was here in Nova Scotia called the Graveyard of the Atlantic. Well, that's for a reason. I mean, there are many, many shipwrecks around, and a lot of them are say, quote, spectacular. You do have to understand that none of them are going to be an intact Spanish galleon sitting upright on the bottom with a chest full of doubloons open for you to pilfer. But no, there are some great wrecks here.
That's unfortunate. No baggies of gold on the bottom waiting for me to discover. At least, well, maybe there are. You've got some ties in Bell Island. I know you've dove off Bell Island, and those wrecks are gaining some attention lately. Tell me about diving there.
Yeah, my wife, co-owner of the shop, Karen, she's from Bell Island, grew up there, and spent a lot of time on Bell Island and dove the Bell Island shipwrecks quite a few times. There's 4 of them there. They're all iron ore carriers, sunk in 2 separate attacks by German U-boats. The shallowest one, the PLM 27, sits top of it around 50, 55 feet, bottom's close to 100. And then the deepest one is the Rose Castle, which is probably running about 110, 115 down to probably as deep as 160. But they're all spectacular dives. They are, in fact, intact and sitting upright on the bottom. Limited penetration opportunities, just spectacular diving. The best wreck diving I've done anywhere in the world, actually. The great thing about Newfoundland is the water, at least around Bell Island, is unbelievably clear for most of the year. So you get Caribbean-like visibility. The only downside is it's just freezing cold. It's even colder than Nova Scotia. So even in midsummer, you definitely want to have a dry suit because it is not warm.
But if you're willing to brave it, you get some beautiful diving out.
If you ever have the chance, I can't recommend it enough. It's awesome diving. Speaking
of some interesting Nova Scotia diving, there's a picture that I can basically see on the camera behind you in your office of some guys in some crazy-looking dry suits and some crazy-looking rebreathers. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, that's my Uncle Wally. He passed away a number of years ago, but back in the 60s and 70s, he was big into the diving scene, actually in Ontario. And back, especially in the 60s, you really couldn't buy pre-made dive gear. You sort of looked in Popular Mechanics and figured out how to manufacture your own. So he got together a group of guys, and they called themselves the Kitchen Waterloo Dolphins. They basically sewed together their own wetsuits. They did actually buy some early dry suits, which were quite interesting because they didn't have zippers, because watertight zippers didn't exist for dry suits back then. So his was a neck entry that you actually crawled into through the neck. And it didn't have valves, so you just got a wicked dry suit squeeze as you went down. And then after a while, they got from the open circuit and started manufacturing their own rebreathers. They were pure oxygen rebreathers, so the only downside was you couldn't go below about 20 or 30 feet because of oxygen toxicity.
But build them themselves. I think a lot of rebreathers, divers today would be amazed by that fact.
Yeah, they started off with a lot of parts from aircraft they use for oxygen delivery systems on aircraft. And he even told me the counter lung inside of his rebreather was actually one of those inflatable sport seats like you'd use when you go to see a football game. So they got pretty creative.
I would say so. It's the most rewarding time of your career or moment in your career.
I don't know if there's been one moment. I would have to say something that happens at least once a year that makes you think it's all worthwhile kind of thing is when you teach a new student to scuba dive and they're just excited and they're just, wow, like you've changed my life. I've seen something I never thought I would ever see. And then you kind of watch that diver evolve and take more courses. And a lot of them someday end up being instructors and some of them end up working for us. But you see a lot of lives actually change through scuba diving. So that's I would say the most spectacular part of the job.
Well, that makes me think of the fact that you used to work at your father's business for a number of years. And now your daughter is working for you and has been for a couple of years teaching for you. Is some sort of circle of life thing? Is the Weichert family going to be running Torpedo Rays for for the next 3 or 4 generations, I hope?
Who knows? I mean, like many businesses, we're definitely a family business. Like you say, I worked for my father for many years before starting this business. And April works for us now, and her 2 sisters have worked for us a little on and off. So, yeah, who knows? Maybe when grandkids come along, they'll take things over. And by then, Torpedo Rays will be a giant multinational with locations all over the globe.
Right. You'll have enough family to run all the regional headquarters.
Exactly. Yeah.
So if you could give one piece of advice to a new scuba diver, what would it be?
I would say the biggest piece of advice is just get out there and dive. A lot of people take the course, they love diving, and then just because of time constraints or job restraints or whatever, they just don't get out and dive, and then they sort of forget about it. So if you enjoy diving, get out there and dive, make time for it. I know everyone's got limited resources and limited amounts of time, but if you love it, just, I guess as Nike says, just do it.
That's very true. You have to do something repetitively to make it a habit. And even if it's something you want to do, if you don't get out there and do it occasionally, there won't be that urge kicking you in to go diving. And it's definitely a lot of fun and worth the effort.
I mean, I'm just kind of curious how you got into scuba diving in the first place.
After living in Alberta for 10 years, I moved to Nova Scotia and quickly noticed that the province was surrounded by the ocean. I thought, man, there's probably a lot of neat stuff in the ocean. And happened to actually be driving down the Bedford Highway one time and passed by a dive shop, which is no longer in existence. But anyway, noticed they had a Learn to Dive sign out front. I thought, yeah, that'd be a lot of fun. And Karen and I had always talked about learning to scuba dive. So I went in, took our course, and just fell in love with it, and it went from there.
I was going to throw in when we talked about gear that you never would have imagined in year one. Mm-hmm. The full-face snorkeling mask.
The full-face snorkeling mask. Okay, that is definitely a piece of gear I never would have imagined. And I have to fully admit, when I first saw them, it's like nobody is ever going to buy that. And yet they're tremendously popular. They actually work really well. And yeah, I mean, it caught me off guard, that one. Yeah, I would never have thought that was going to catch on.
I think everybody in the scuba industry has thought the exact same thing, and now they're literally saving people's lives. It's the weirdest turn of events.
Yeah, it just goes to show, never judge anything just because you've been in the industry for decades. You never know it all. You never know what's going to catch on and what's not. Mm-hmm. There's many things that have been tried and failed over the years, and some things you see and you think, oh, people are going to love that, and they're going to buy them like crazy, and nobody buys it. And then other things you think, oh, that'll never sell, and people love them and buy all kinds of them. So it's hard to judge.
Yeah, people always surprise you.
Maybe one of the most unique products that I ever saw, which didn't catch on, which I thought was kind of neat years ago, Mari's came out with a talking dive computer called the Dive Mate. And it actually hung on your mask strap over your ear, and it would talk to you through the dive. So it'd say, you are at 50 feet. Your no decompression limit is 10 minutes. I thought that was kind of cool. Apparently, I was the only one that thought that was cool.
Nobody wants to be told when their dive's going to end.
I was told the only people that bought them were blind divers because obviously they can't read a normal dive computer.
I'm kind of curious, actually, where, this whole pandemic aside, where you see scuba diving going in the future, at least on a local level, from your perspective.
Well, I'd like to think it's back on the upswing. Last few years we've seen more people getting back into the sport and more younger people getting into the sport. Demographically, again, things have changed over the last 25 years. Scuba used to be predominantly young men taking the course. Now it's pretty much evenly split, men and ladies. And also you're seeing more older people getting into the sport, more people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, even their 60s. But the last couple of years, we have seen more people, again, in your teens, 20s, early 30s getting into the sport. And they're some of the most active divers, and they're out there a lot. Also good to see people are becoming more ecologically aware, looking after the ocean. Again, back in the old days, you had some people that just wanted to go down to shipwrecks with a hammer and a crowbar and steal anything that they could possibly get off. Now people, want to take their camera down and take pictures rather than removing items from the ocean, which is a good thing.
Yeah, that's definitely a positive thing.
Yeah, there's more beach cleanups going on. People are concerned more about, dead lobster traps being left in the ocean that are catching things, and there's no one there to haul them up and get the lobster out. So, like I say, overall, people are becoming more aware that, the ocean is very important ecologically and that we need to look after it.
Well, Jason, thanks a lot for taking the time to chat with us. Look forward to next time we get to do it.
Well, you're most welcome. Anytime.
Hi everyone, I just wanted to take a second to thank our sponsor, Torpedo Rays Scuba. Torpedo Rays is a local dive shop in Nova Scotia. If you're not in Nova Scotia, that's okay. They've got a wonderful website, torpedorays.com, TORPEDORAYS.com. All of the scuba gear you could ever need is there. If you can't find it, give Jason a call, 902-481-0444, and he'll be happy to help you out. And these challenging times, it's always great to shop local. Don't go to a huge big box. Help support your local dive shop. Buy something you've had your eye on. Excellent time to make a good deal. Buy a gift certificate to use later. Whatever the case may be, Torpedo Rays and torpedorays.com will be there for you. Once again, their number is 902-481-0444 or torpedorays.com.
It was really good to have our first guest on the show and to have Jason as the sponsor of this podcast, to have him have the honor to be the first guest here. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah, he was our first guest, but I think he's going to be my favorite guest. I thought it was really fun to interview my dad and kind of hear what he had to say and hear his stories. And there is a lot of stuff that I actually didn't know. So even I learned some new things, but I am always interested to hear what my dad has to say. I do. Maybe I'm a little biased, but I think he's brilliant. So it's probably my favorite interview I think we'll do.
Yeah, no, he's an excellent businessman, and it says a lot that he can keep a dive shop up and running for such a long time when it's such a challenge to keep a small business going for more than a few years, let alone multiple decades.
I think what he said too about, he wanted to follow his dream, and that's why he left Canadian Tire. He's true to his word. I mean, even in my life when, I'm graduating university now, and my parents have always told me, do something you love, and if you do something you love, you'll never work a day in your life. So he's very honest when he says that. So I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, most definitely. All right, let's go over to Nick and talk about Thinking Blue.
On today's segment of Think Blue, I just want to talk a little bit of buoyancy. Buoyancy is one of those skills that we can do a lot with. It's primarily a safety skill for a diver. Good buoyancy is often one of the hallmarks of a competent diver. So combined with good trim, proper finning technique, equipment configuration, it enhances relaxation and air consumption and generally makes you an all-around better diver. And it's especially important when you're operating another piece of kit as a diver, like a dry suit or a DSMB or a camera. So anything that you're adding or modifying to your kit that's going to change your buoyancy, and it's especially important in overhead environments. But at the same time, it's one of the most important skills that you can master as a diver to minimize your impact in the marine environment. So generally, divers should learn to stay off the bottom at all times to avoid damaging marine life. From an instructor's perspective, you should really select learning environments that aren't sensitive, something abiotic like sandy bottom or rocky substrate, as opposed to, doing it on a reef. And you tend to see that sometimes.
Right.
But these environments aren't entirely devoid of life, so like instructors should use their judgment. But you generally train or dive if you don't have good buoyancy somewhere where you're going to minimize any impact. Good buoyancy control should really apply anywhere you go. But it's super, super important in critical environments where there's sensitive things like coral reef systems. We're just like kicking something with a fin, we're not paying attention. Or grabbing a coral can really like kill an entire like colony, or pushing off because you don't have good buoyancy, or you can kill invertebrates. And the same applies for wrecks, right? We think of wrecks as these metal objects that are derelict, but they're actually really important systems for building reef, and a substrate for like a base for coral to grow on and invertebrates to grow on, and they're also provide a refuge for animals. So not because it's something that's been left behind that you should treat it as trash necessarily.
Right.
And getting good buoyancy control takes time, right? I mean, you learn the basics in an entry level course, but it takes time to master, and you could practice that through specialty courses or just by practicing. You can do that, practicing good buoyancy skill. You can do that, off the bottom in the water column or in a pool, for example. So ultimately, if you want to be a competent diver, good buoyancy skill is a plus just from a diving point of view. So even if you're not that concerned about the environment, just having good buoyancy control is good that way. But it's just kind of a win-win all around. So that's kind of a little bit for Think Blue this week. I also just wanted to add that this Wednesday is also the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. Every year on April 22nd, Earth Day marks the anniversary of the modern environmental movement that started in 1970. Because of COVID, obviously everything's kind of going digital. So this year you can join Earth Day Live or find a digital event at earthday.org, and we'll include the link in the show notes.
Looking forward to 50 years of Earth Day.
There you go.
And some neutrally buoyant swimming when this is all over.
And April 22nd is also my dog's first birthday, so.
Oh, well, I mean, so many things going on. How are we going to choose?
What are the odds?
Did you name it Pluto?
What a day.
Guinness, but like same thing, right?
Speaking of good diving, Nick, you have a dive site review for us this week.
Absolutely. So this is another one of our rotating segments that we're going to be doing on the podcast, and I will be giving a personal review of a dive site in Nova Scotia and abroad. So the first dive site that I'm going to be reviewing is probably Torpedo Rays' most popular dive site. It has seen thousands, probably in the thousands of students certified there, and is a tried and true site for any diver. It is, of course, Paddy's Head. So it's probably one of the staff and divers' favorites to go to. Really easy entryway, easy walk down into the site. Plenty of room for packing up, so you don't have to worry about any of those sort of roadside dive sites that we have a few of those in the province. Home to plenty of wildlife, so lots of lobster, lots of species of fish. There's seen eels. It's also home to some tropical fish during certain times of the year when warm currents bring some tropical fish up. It really seems to be sort of the go-to spot for divers in the area, just because it's so easy to get in and out of, easy to get to, and it's not super far away from the city. So I think it's about 40 minutes away, which in the scheme of things, not that bad. The only downside to Paddy's is there isn't a lot of deep water around. Personally, and I love deep water. I love deep dives. Deeper is absolutely better, in my opinion. So that'd be my only knock of Paddy's Head. But for the most part, it's good for teaching at around 40 feet to 60 feet if you want to go for a bit of a swim. Any deep water there, you're really going to have to go for a bit of a swim out into the bay. I did also spend a fair bit of time there last summer, TAing for the Dalhousie University's scientific diver course, which was run by an ex-T-Rays staff member. It was a Rob Fairweather. So he got to teach that course, which was super cool. It was an awesome location to teach that course. Tons of wildlife, lots of research areas that we can find some gravel areas, sand, or some rocky areas to do some bathymetry testing. And I also saw an eel on one of the dives, which I honestly didn't think we had a lot of eels out here. And I was on the first dive, I was the only one that saw it. So I came up and like, is there any eels? And people were like, well, I guess there could be eels, but I was the only one that saw it. So it sounds like I don't know what I'm talking about, which when you're a TA for a university course with like third or fourth year marine biology students, you really got to know what you're talking about, or you just sound like you're making stuff up. So I was committed to having somebody else find an eel. And on the last day of diving, we were doing a night dive for like the last day of diving for the course before we all left. We were doing a night dive, and it was me and Courtney Baumgartner who were diving together. And she works at the dive shop, another T-Rays staff member. And me and her found an eel in some of the seagrass there. So I actually got a witness to see an eel. Is American eel. Apparently they come up with the warm water currents from the east coast of the United States. So that was really cool. Along with some of the other warm water or tropical fish they could find up there. So what are your guys' favorite Paddy's Head stories that you got? I'm sure we have some.
I mean, I don't know if I have any one specific favorite dive there, but I do have definitely some good events there. Like, I love seeing the tropical and subtropical stuff that we get at the end of summer. So one season we had just, I don't know, there had to be half a dozen, maybe 8 gray Atlantic triggerfish there, and they were all hanging out under these rocks, and you could feed them the green crab. Green crab, the only thing cool. you can safely distribute as food to other fish because they're invasive species. That's why, of course. So that was a lot of fun, and I always love when that's the only place I ever see the flying gunards, the little guys. They look like a small sculpin, but then they've got the big, like, beautiful butterfly wings. Those things are super cool.
Yeah, my favorite moment at Paddy's Head, because I hadn't been diving in cold water for that long, is seeing like that first subtropical tropical fish like come up there, and I was just like, whoa, this is way out of place, and it just looked really weird. So yeah, that's probably one of my first memories of Paddy's Head.
I feel like Paddy's Head is a big go-to for me, so I have like an embarrassing amount of dives at Paddy's Head between teaching and club dives and leisure dives. So I remember Nick Fisher's very first dive in Nova Scotia was Paddy's Head, which I got to be a dive buddy on, which was pretty cool. I remember on that dive, we were out, I don't know, we maybe got like 40 feet. It wasn't overly deep. And on our way back, something happened to my dry suit valve. So none of the bubbles were coming out when I was trying to dump air. So it like seized up or something. I remember I had to like climb the like rock wall on the side so I didn't have an uncontrolled ascent. So I was literally just like rock climbing up, like holding on for dear life, like watching my dive computer, making sure that I didn't break my safety stop. And I remember Nick met me at the top, and I was so embarrassed because I was like, God, this is my first dive with Nick, and he's going to think I suck. But in reality, it's like something wrong with my dry suit valve. But that was my like one dive at Paddy's Head that I think I won't forget because it was Nick's first and probably the only dive at Paddy's Head I've ever messed up. So
it was mind-blowing for me to be able to go diving after work. What I was used to was you're driving out, I guess, after work, but you're driving like an hour and a half to get to the dive site, and then you're camping for the weekend. So it was just mind-blowing to me to be able to just like pack up the car and go hit a dive site on the way home, essentially. Just go for a dive and then just mosey on home afterwards. So yeah, that was definitely a memorable dive. And April, like, I really had no idea that you were having an issue with your dry suit on that dive. I just thought you're just hanging out at the surface for a minute. So no need. No,
terrible buddy.
Up.
Terrible
I didn't know
buddy.
any better. I was too distracted by seeing sea life for the first time in Canada to be all that worried about your dry suit. So no worries there.
I remember too, like after the dive, like it's just like, oh yeah, that's like your standard Patty's Head dive. And I remember you, Nick, you were like freaking out. You were like, that was the best dive I've ever had. I saw so much wildlife. Did you see those lobster? That was awesome. And I was like, yeah, that was cool. It definitely wasn't like the other million dives I've had here.
Oh my God. So that was a fantastic dive. All in all, I'd probably give Patty's Head a 4 out of 5 stars for nostalgia, ease, but not deep enough. That's where you lose a star at Patty's Head. That's my say.
Patty's gonna have to work on it. Maybe dig some trenches or something. Get a little deeper.
I'll bring a shovel.
I love Patty's Head.
Bring a shovel.
I feel like I gotta name my first child Patty or something. Like,
I'm gonna hold you to that. I'm gonna keep
I'll
track
name
of
him Patty Ray.
Patty Ray. And then if he works at Torpedo Rays, then finally somebody can say
Finally, we'll have a Ray.
Finally, there'll be a Ray at Torpedo Rays.
And there's the episode title.
I'll write that down now. Well, before we get too far off track, let's go over to Nick Winkler and see what our book recommendation is this week.
Right, so this week I've got one of my favorite books. It's called 7 Miles Down, the story of the Bathyscaphe Trieste. It's written by Jacques Picard and Robert Dietz. It's the book that really recounts how the Bathyscaphe, it's an early submarine for deep sea exploration, named Trieste after where it was built. It really recounts the story of how the sub was built, designed, tested, and it was subsequently piloted by Swiss explorer Jacques Picard and a U.S. Navy officer Don Walsh, who were the first to dive to the deepest point of the ocean, the Marianas Trench in the Pacific Ocean, in an excess of 10,900 meters, and that was in 1960. So the book really harks back to tales of deep sea exploration, international cooperation, because the sub was Swiss designed, Italian built, and eventually U.S. Navy owned for the dive to the trench. Swiss explorer Picard is the son of Auguste Picard, who pioneered hot air ballooning exploration at the turn of the century. And one of those things in terms of balloon exploration included dropping ballast pellets from church towers onto people to test its safety. So like if you were to drop ballast from hot air balloons, would you injure people from the air? And that method was actually using pellets to control ballast in the sub was actually used, right, to control the Trieste. And interestingly enough, Picard is also the father of Bertrand Picard, who co-led the Solar Impulse mission to fly the first solar plane around the world. I think it's the record in 2016, the first circumnavigation of the Earth piloted by a fixed-wing aircraft using only solar power. So really like a whole generation of explorers in that family, from a long time ago right up to the present. It's a really neat read because it's one of the great feats of ocean exploration. One of the cool stories in the book really recounts how Picard had to smuggle a Swiss flag onto the boat, onto the sub, because at that point it was U.S. Navy owned, and bringing a foreign flag was not allowed. So he kind of tucked it in with them. And there's also a really cool part of the book that talks about an explosion on the way down to the trench. So you'll really have to read the book to find out. So the reason that this book is a bit of a challenge, it was written back in 1961 and it's out of print. And it's hard to find. With a little bit of research, a little bit of perseverance, you'll probably be able to find it. It's going to take you a little while, but it's a fun little project to keep you occupied in this time, and it's a great read. I definitely recommend it.
Awesome. We'll have to take up that challenge, see if we can find a copy. This will just be like an episode of This Week Tonight, where he tries to get random pieces of art. We'll have to start collecting the books that Nick recommends and putting them on the wall behind us.
This is the expert mode book review. If you can find it, read it. You're going to like it, but good luck.
Yeah.
It's like the starting of a movie or something.
Well, thank you, Nick, for that excellent recommendation again. Let's talk to April about your safety tip this week.
So my safety tip this week, probably one of the first safety tips you'll hear in your open water course, but it's always dive with a buddy. I feel like this one's super important, especially during isolation, because I have heard of some people through the old grapevine who have said they're going to venture out on their own, but I think it is important to remember it's good to dive with a buddy, unless maybe you're a certified self-reliant diver. And, right now, if you don't have a buddy to dive with, then unfortunately, maybe it's not a good time to dive. But at while saying that, I mean, anything can happen. No matter how experienced you are, I mean, even as instructors, as we all are, things happen that sometimes are out of your control. So it's always good to have someone there. I mean, even like the story I told earlier with my dry suit valve seizing up and not letting out air, that could have not gone so well. You know, maybe there wasn't a rock wall for me to scale, and I really would have needed a buddy in that scenario. So there's lots of times when it's important to have your buddy with you. So my advice this week is always dive with a buddy.
Excellent advice. I always have to remind people that their backup gear, 99% of the time, most divers, is on the person that's swimming next to you, not on you. So, you got to have a buddy.
I think
No matter how good you think you are, it's always good to have your buddy there.
I think it would be good to do an episode on solo diving.
No, that would be an interesting topic.
It would be.
People can make arguments against solo diving, even with proper training and equipment. And there's lots of good arguments on both sides.
But my point was more to like the fact that you want to, if you're going to be a solo diver, you want to do it through training and experience rather than by luck or accident or just by trial and error. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That really gives us something to think about there on the safety aspects, April. Thank you for that. You also have somebody for us to follow on social media this week, right?
Yeah. So this week, I'm recommending you all to follow Girls That Scuba. Their account is just at Girls That Scuba. They're an entire account dedicated to literally women that scuba dive, and I think all of our listeners know that I am very interested in women in diving, and I fully support them. They are the women's largest female dive community. They also have a couple of side pages. They also have Girls That Free Dive and Girls That Tech Dive, but Girls That Scuba is kind of like their main page, and those are their little branches off. But if you're interested for a little scuba page, they are kind of fun to follow. They do a lot of cool things, and the sea foxes are very inspired by them.
Awesome. That's good to know. I didn't know about their side pages and that.
They commented on our COVID post, and we were all freaking out. We were like in our group chat, all like, "Oh my God, did you see what they said?" We were all freaking out. It was like Christmas. Like,
We've made it.
We made it. That's literally what Jess said. Jess was like, "We made it."
We're famous.
Yeah, exactly. I got like 20 screenshots within like 5 minutes.
One day, people will be saying that about us when we're commenting on their Facebook posts.
One day. It's
One
coming.
day.
Oh my God.
Dive In Podcast.
Dive In Podcast commented on my post. Oh my God.
Oh my God.
We made it.
We made it.
Excellent. Well, that does it for today's episode. I'd like to thank my co-hosts, Nick Fisher.
Again, as always, thanks for having me, Justin.
Anytime, literally anytime. Nicholas Winkler, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us here, and thanks everyone for listening. Hope you keep following us.
And last but not least, the birthday girl, April Weicker.
Thank you, Justin, for having me. And, Nick and Nick, Fish and Wink. It's always a treat, and especially a treat on my big day.
Fish and Wink. One day you guys will hear, the audience will hear that outtake. Getting our buddy cop show together, Fish and Wink.
But not today.
You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at divein.thepodcast. You can also email us at divein.thepodcast@gmail.com. You can follow me at idiveok. April's at April Weichert. Nick Winkler is at Nicholas Winkler Photography. Nicholas Fisher is at scuba_406. You can find links for everything we mentioned today in the show notes or on our website, diveinthepodcast.podbean.com. We'll see you next Monday when we speak to Jared Klucher of the Halifax Freediving Club. This episode of Dive in the Podcast was brought to you by our sponsor, Torpedo Rays Scuba. Head over to your favorite podcast app to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. It's very much appreciated. Thank you for listening.
Before we hang up today, I just wanted to again thank the Sea Foxes for the super sweet birthday video they made for me. If anyone else wants to check it out, I did post it on my social media so you can see it. But that was a nice little surprise this morning. So thank you, girls, for doing that for me.
That was very nice of them for sure. Thanks, Sea Foxes.